I will be talking to you about bee nutrition and a little bit about some of the work that we have actually done when it comes to research that pertains to nutrition for honeybees and some other bees as well. But it should be fairly straightforward talk. And we'll see if we can glean any answers as to what to feed when you're out there feeding your bees, but we'll see how it goes. And again, as Kian said, let's make sure that put your questions in the chat so you don't forget them, and we can have a chat at the end of the talk, and we can hopefully all kind of interact with each other. So in terms of what are the stressors that are causing issues to honeybees and other pollinators, I think this is really something that everybody at this point is aware of, and I'm sure you've seen some rendition of this graphic along the way. I think all the researchers at this point put something similar to this in their presentations. Everybody has their favorite. I keep going back and forth between different ones, but I think the point and the message is clear. There are a lot of different stressors that are impacting honeybees, and amongst those is bee food supply as well. So not only bee food supply or lack thereof do we see that as a stressor, but also we would like to now move forward and use it as a potential solutions to some of the other problems that we're seeing with honeybees and solution for some of the other stressors that impact honeybees. And again, other pollinators as well. I'm well aware of that, but I think for our purposes, we're going to focus on honeybees, of course. So we're going to jump right into it, and we're just going to quickly review some of the nutrition that the bees need and nutrition that the or food sources that the honeybees bring in when they go out and forage. And of course, they need their sugars or their carbohydrates, and they get that from, of course, collecting nectar, converting it into honey. They need proteins and lipids, and most of the proteins and lipids will come from the pollen that they collect from various plants. And of course, in addition to proteins and lipids, which are macronutrients, pollen also contains a lot of the micronutrients that the bees need. So minerals and vitamins and some of the other, again, as I said, micronutrients. And I think that is the reason why it has been so challenging to actually produce a supplement that is equivalent, right, or that is as good as natural pollen and even natural nectar, because sugar water, for example, if we're feeding it, it doesn't contain what the honey and nectar contain when the bees bring it in. Same with some of the protein supplements. And of course, bees, we can't forget, bees need water. So in addition to carbohydrates and proteins and lipids, bees need water. And we always talk and discuss this when we talk to sort of a novice beekeepers. We tell them to make sure that they have a water source that is available year-round to their bees, and talk a little bit about how we anchor those bees into that water source. And I don't think there's really any straightforward answer. Bees often will go out after the water that contains, again, some of those micronutrients that they deem themselves that they need in the colony. So it's really difficult to say, like, okay, if you do this to the water, they will definitely go into your water versus your neighbor's pool, right? So that can be a little bit of a challenge with water. Okay, and this is just a little photo or a little video of the honeybee collecting nectar, and you can also nicely see here a nice pollen load. So she's both probing for nectar and she's also collected pollen. Okay, this is going back to basics, and again, I'm not sure how well versed you are in bee biology and bee behavior, but hopefully it's going to be a review for most of you. Bees, honeybees specifically, become foragers at about 3 or so weeks of age. So they exhibit temporal polyphism, which essentially means that throughout their lifespan, they will go through different tasks, right? So They will start off as cleaning the cells in the colony. They will then be nurses. They will do a number of these progressive tasks until the time when they become foragers at about, again, as I said, 3 weeks of age. And it is highly variable when this happens, and it really depends on the needs of the colony. What's really cool about honeybees is they're very plastic. So they have plastic behavior. For example, if a colony, for whatever reason, unexpected reason, loses a good portion of nurse bees suddenly, a portion of forager bees can revert back into being nurse bees and doing in-hive tasks, right? So it's really amazing what they can do. And the honeybees, when they become foragers, they only live for a short amount of time in the summertime, of course, we're talking about. So only about a week to about 2 to 3 weeks after they become foragers. So it's not actually really long lifespan. So of course, the foragers will go out, they will locate the food sources. We're not going to be reviewing that today, but I do like this little, and hopefully it will work. I do like this little video of a dance language, right, that we talk about quite a bit when it comes to honeybee communication. They will communicate with this dance language as to where the food sources are, right? So they will communicate that. This is a video not of bees communicating foraging locations, right? Obviously, this is an outside swarm, but they do something very similar for when they're communicating where the next nest should be. And so these are scout bees communicating excitedly about the location of a nest, but again, they do something very similar in the colony when they're communicating the location of the forage. So let's see if this works. There we go. So you can see, like, for example, this bee is very excited about the new potential nest. There are a number of them, right? So let's see, like this one right here. So you can see them, they're going in this like figure 8 pattern, right? And again, they do the same thing when they're communicating food sources. And again, I use this video because it's obviously much easier to see what they're doing versus having to go inside an observation hive even, or regular hive to look for foragers specifically. Okay. Going back a little bit more in depth about these different food sources, nectar, of course, is the main carbohydrate source, as I mentioned, and of course there are other phytochemicals as well in the nectar that are present. Their process nectar, of course, is collected. The bees will go out, forage on nectar. They will slurp it up essentially, and they will carry it back in their honey stomach. And then that nectar is processed into honey eventually. Nectar, when the bees come back, is transferred to receiver bees, which then deposit it into cells. And while they're doing that, throughout that process, they will actually dry the nectar out. So they will, it's really interesting to watch it. If you can go on YouTube, I'm sure you can find some videos. They will pick up a nectar droplet with their mandibles, right? So they're chewing mouth parts. They will pick up a droplet, they will stretch it out. And because the bees do have the ability to move their wings and with their thoracic muscles, right? They will fan the nectar, they will dry it down, right? And they, of course, add some of the enzymes that will convert the sugars in nectar into monocarbohydrates. Carbohydrates are necessary for bees as a source of energy, right? So for example, for bees in colder climates, right? For example, Northeast, the bees will store this nectar into honey. They will convert it into honey. They will store it so they can eat it throughout the winter and they will survive, right? So it's their food stores. For us, that can actually be during the summer. So when we have dearth, when there are no food sources around, the bees will use that stored honey often to survive when there's no feed outside. And they also do utilize the carbohydrate source of energy to produce wax. So it's really important for them to have really good nectar flow and access to feed, specifically sugar feed. if during the springtime, when they're building up their population, when they're splitting, right, when they're swarming and they're budding off and they're doing their reproductive cycle, they really need that good nectar flow, which will help them build a new nest, right? And then, of course, nectar contains different phytochemicals. They are involved in the determination of development of honeybee females into workers or queens. So queens don't get fed these phytochemicals that are present in nectar, and that seems to drive their transition into queens and development into queens versus workers, right? It can also help with pathogen resistance. It can help with longevity, at least in cages. And I'll talk a little bit about some of this work that we're doing in the lab, trying to utilize the presence of these naturally occurring phytochemicals to bolster supplements for beekeeping. Okay, so in terms of protein and lipids, bees collect pollen, right? And pollen is collected, and then the bees will eat it, and they will convert it into brood food. They use it, of course, as I said, to reproduction. Queens will need a lot of proteins to produce eggs. Brood food, so a little bit of bee bread, nectar is mixed with the glandular secretions that the bees will produce, and they will feed it to the brood. It also can improve the immune responsiveness of bees, so it helps them deal with pathogens better, even can help them with detoxification pathways and improving the ability of honeybees to deal with pesticides that they have been exposed to. So there's some work that was done by Judy Wu Smart in Nebraska, and I believe she was working with specifically, say, one of the neonicotinoids. I want to say metacloprid. But she has found that bees that were exposed to one of the neonicotinoids, of course, decline. But if you then pick up those colonies or those bees and you move them into clean forage, they recover, right? So there are a lot of benefits to having access to healthy pollen. Of course, the main thing here is for brood production, right? So we want to make sure that the bees have enough food to produce brood. And this is a great photo by Randy Oliver, and I think it really drives home the point. If you are going into your bees and you're wondering if your bees have enough food, specifically protein, you can take a look at the brood. And these are larvae, right? So if you're looking inside your cells, we're inside the brood chamber, you can see some of these larvae down here in the corner are very dry, meaning they probably don't have enough nutrition. All right, so they most likely don't have enough nutrition. Of course, another aspect of that could be that they don't have enough high enough worker population to take care of the bees, but most likely they need some extra supplemental nutrition, specifically protein, so the nurse bees can produce enough glandular secretions or brood food to feed the brood. So you can see it, it's kind of swimming in this worker jelly. Bees, in addition to water, which they use for drinking, of course, they're animals, so they require some water, and then also they use it for climate control. As I mentioned, they can fan, so they will actually do evaporative cooling. They will pick up some of that water and do the same thing. They will fan over the droplets of water to cool down the hive. That's especially important to us here in California when it gets super hot in the summer. And I think Kim Flodham in his book had at one point stated that a colony needs at least a quart of, that seems like not a lot. I'll have to check it back, but he had a specific measurement for what a colony would need during the day to support that colony, especially if it's in a higher temperature environment. Okay. So always make sure you have a water source because it's very needed by them. And bees also forage for propolis. Propolis is not necessarily part of their nutrition, but it can certainly be very helpful to them. It has antimicrobial properties. We call it bee glue. I'm sure everybody here is aware of propolis and very familiar with it, because when you go into a hive, oftentimes you get the hive that's stuck, right? So that's why we use a hive tool, because you have to pry open the hive and pry the frames away from one another because of propolis. And propolis is just plant resin that the bees will bring in. They mix it with a little bit of wax. They plug up any holes in the hive, and also what they do in a natural nest. And we're actually trying to kind of co-opt that and use it in everyday bee management. They will take that propolis and they will line the inside of the cavity, of a natural cavity of the nest, with propolis, and that actually gives them a level of resistance to certain diseases, right? And actually, there is a colleague of mine who's working on looking at the use of propolis and the efficacy of propolis to be used as a tool for managing varroa mites. And it does seem to have some inhibitory effect on varroa mites. Propolis, I'm not going to go further into it, but I do know that there's also some research trying to see if the inside of the boxes, Langstroth boxes, can be scored in such a way that the bees will do the propolis lining inside of the Langstroth boxes to help promote their immune system, which is what they normally don't do. The inside of the boxes, if you remember, it's very smooth. And when it's very smooth, the bees don't actually put propolis on that inside of the box. Okay, so this is, I'm leading with the, the final conclusion now, right? I'm going to start with the final conclusion at the very beginning. Natural nutrition has been shown to be best over and over again, right? So we have researchers all across the world, right, looking at the nutrition impact on health of the pollinators, of course, honeybees, and over again, we are finding that natural nutrition or access to natural food sources is the best when it comes to supporting honeybees and honeybee health and honeybee growth, right? So unfortunately, that can be very challenging. And this is really just a snippet of a graphic here by from one of the papers from Dr. Gloria de Grande Hoffman. And again, just a snippet and an example of what I mean by that. So they've used 4 different diets. 2 diets were supplemental diets, right? And then they had 2 natural sites where they measured black queen cell virus in the colonies that were either given these diets or were present in these different sites that had different nutrition. And you can see that on these artificial diets, right, the black queen cell virus was higher than when the bees had access to natural forage. And again, this has been shown pretty much over and over and over again. Not always. So this is just one measurement potentially of honeybee health, right? But it does show that access to multi-source natural diets tends to be the best. So the best message I can give you and the best advice I can give you is to talk to your local bee clubs, especially if you're new to beekeeping, right? And figure out what's blooming at what time and watch to make sure that the foragers are bringing in that pollen, right? Watch that the foragers are bringing in food. And if you are into gardening just as much as you are into beekeeping, a great way to support your bees and other bees as well as other pollinators is to plant feed, right? To plant plants for them that are pollinator supportive, right? So they're pollinator supportive, they produce nectar and pollen year round, and especially if we're in California, Central California, right? Depends on where you are. There's usually something that can be in bloom year round. So that those are some of our messaging is not, you're not going to save the honeybees by becoming a beekeeper necessarily, right? But what anybody can do to help support honeybees and pollinator health in general is plant plants that they can use for their food. And in fact, we have an excellent resource that was put together by Dr. Christine Casey, who is the UC Davis Bee Haven manager. And you can have access to that information on this website right here. And you will have, after we're done with this talk, I will put the slides into the Google Drive. I think Kian has shared that with you already, so I'll put those into Google Drive and you can access that website. However, even though we know that natural nutrition is the best, we often do have to provide supplements. And I think towards the end of my presentation, I have a single slide that I took a photo of from one of the beekeepers, and it shows their feeding regime, right? So in Northern California, right, we do have to provide food and especially carbohydrates early in the spring sometimes, if we're not going into almonds or there's nothing right after almonds, but definitely later in the season, starting in June sometimes even, not just July, but sometimes even in June, we have that dearth period here that we need to make sure that the bees have the food. Otherwise, what happens is if you don't have access to food, and especially nectar, like sugar, the bees will do what? Actually, I'm going to ask you now. You can quickly add it into the chat. What happens if you don't provide bees with the feed during dearth periods? You can just put it in the chat. And why is it so important to provide nutrition, not just to support the bees, but in terms of their health and not starving? But what's another really important reason to provide nutrition? Robbing. Thank you, Melissa. Robbing exactly can be the problem, right? So you want to avoid that, and you want to make sure that your bees are not going out there foraging in other colonies. It's a great way to collect pathogens, right, and transmit diseases around. And of course, your bees might not survive if they're trying to go in. Those colonies will try and defend their stores. So it's really important to prevent robbing. In terms of supplements, carbohydrate supplements, there are various supplements that are available for purchase, right? So you can also make sugar water. 1-to-1 ratio is really, so it's kind of a thin syrup. It's recommended for comb building in the springtime. So if there isn't a nectar flow for some reason in the area where you are, or if it's right before almonds or right after almonds, but there's nothing else out there blooming, for example, you are recommended to give 1-to-1 sugar water supplement. Or if you are providing them with slightly thicker syrup that they can actually store for overwintering or during the dearth period, you want to provide 2-to-1 ratio of sugar to water for storage. And as I mentioned, there are many supplements available, or I shouldn't say many, but there are some supplements available. For example, we use ProSweet. Again, disclaimer, we're only using ProSweet because it is available through Man Lake fairly easily. And it does seem to keep a lot better than sugar solution, which is what we've been using in the past. Okay. There's also some concern with high fructose corn syrup and whether you should be feeding high fructose corn syrup and whether that impacts the health of the bees. There was a study done specifically here at UC Davis by my colleague, Dr. Brian Johnson, and late Dr. Eric Musson, They didn't found any negative effects of feeding high fructose corn syrup. It was a shorter study, so maybe if they did feed longer term, they would have found impact. But in their study in particular, there was no seemingly negative impact. One thing to keep in mind, and I actually don't know why I have it in small letters here. I meant to make it big letters, and it ended up being small letters. But any syrup, any sugar, even nectar and honey, if they stay in the heat, in high temperature for a prolonged time period, they can create this toxic compound. I'm going to try hydroxymeta. I'm not going to try pronounce it, but HMF for short. And I think it is 30 parts per million of HMF in any one sugar feed, right, can be toxic to bees. And there is a little table. I'll show you a good nutrition supplement or good nutrition guide that just came out earlier in January that has a little table as to how long it takes the sugars in nectar and honey at what temperature to convert to this toxic level. For those of us who are in California where it gets really hot, right? If you have any totes that are filled with feed that are sitting outside in high heat, this could potentially be an issue, right? So keep that in mind. Of course, in the wintertime, if necessary, you wouldn't be feeding liquid feed for the bees, right? You can add fondant to them. And you can also add dry sugar. So just call it dry bird, but you can add some basically kind of like powdered sugar into your colonies. Bees will come up and lick it up, right? But it's not going to create that wet environment, which can sometimes, if there's not enough ventilation, it can cause mold to grow. And another point of caution, which has actually come up this year again for a couple of beekeepers, there are some toxic plants or plants that are toxic to honeybees. Specifically for us here, it's California buckeye. It seems to be dependent on the dose. So as long as that's not the only food source that the bees are feeding off of and bringing in, they should be okay. But if that's the only source of food for them, it can actually kill them. And I do know that some beekeepers will strip the pollen that the bees are bringing in from buckeye, California buckeye plant or tree. They will strip it off and they will feed a supplement to prevent and reduce the possibility of the bees dying. Okay. There are a number of different ways in which you can feed the bees the carbohydrates, right? You can have this front feeder, right? It's just a jar that you can put in the front entrance. This is shown here with the nuke because it's early in the season. And again, the recommendation is that you should make sure that there's nectar flow. If there's slow nectar flow early in the season, you definitely want to feed the bees. And especially if you're buying packages and bringing in packages, we always feed our packages, regardless of whether there's nectar flow or not. We feed the packages because you want to stimulate that wax production, right? There are feeding cans that you can put on top of the hive, right? So right here you would have a can with the top would have a hole. You would have a can attached to it. We have, again, as I mentioned, entrance feeders. We have in-hive feeders. This is probably something that is very familiar to at least some of you. And we also have these top feeders. It looks like almost one of the medium boxes, but it has little wooden pieces in there that when you pour sugar into it, it floats up. There's a hole here so the bees can access it. They will come through this hole here and access the sugar feed inside that feeder. I personally don't like these. I've used them when we were in North Carolina, but it's messy, right? It's just messy. When you're checking the colony, you have to remove the entire thing. And it's just, for us, it's easier to have the in-hive feeders. And again, yes, which is what I think about this feeder. It's suitable for cat flocks. Okay, in terms of protein supplements, they're again very important for promoting brood production and supporting the brood development. You can find a number of different feed supplements on the market. Commercial beekeepers will feed definitely prior to almond pollination, so prior to bringing in colonies into almond pollination to promote that growth of the colony, to ensure that there are plenty of foragers that are going out pollinating almonds. You can also, if you want to feed your bees pollen and not just a pollen supplement, right? You can collect pollen and store it, or you can just make your own supplement. There's a number of recipes online. Most of the beekeepers will use brewer's yeast. There's some use of soy protein. Soy protein might not be the greatest because it's a one source protein. So a lot of the times beekeepers will design their own recipes. They will use soy protein or brewer's yeast as a base and then add some pollen into those. And a lot of the artificial pollen supplements, a lot of them actually have a proportion of pollen mixed in with it. So natural pollen mixed in with it, especially if you're buying it in these pollen patties, right? So you can buy it as a dry, essentially powder, or a patty like this. Sometimes you can buy it as a powder that you mix with water and give it to the bees. And again, there are a number of them. In terms of collecting pollen and storing it, two things to keep in mind. You don't know what you're collecting in addition to pollen, right? So pollen often has pesticides and pathogens that are present in them. So be aware of that. I suppose you could probably use pollen and irradiate it, but that's probably expensive. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, pollen does lose its efficacy. The proteins will degrade over time. And there are a couple of studies showing that, for example, if you were to use pollen that's been stored for over a year for queen production, the queen production goes down if you feed the pollen to the cell builders that's been stored. So the pollen, if it's been stored for a year or longer, it reduces the queen production, right? So these are all things to keep in mind. Okay, so the most important thing really is to monitor your colonies to make sure that they do have feed, right? That they have forage that they're bringing in. And you can see that by observing your bees coming back with pollen loads, right? And of course, going into your colonies and doing fairly regular inspections, making sure that they are storing nectar, that they're making honey, and that they are storing and making bee bread, and that the brood is collected, right? If you are not certain of whether, if you're sort of just starting on this journey and you're not certain if you need to feed, you can try feeding, right? So try feeding them and see if they're taking the food down, whether that's carbohydrate or pollen. With pollen or pollen supplements, I would caution you that if you are in an area that is has small hive beetle problems, so it's really anywhere kind of along the coast, even all the way up into Humboldt. I know that they found some small hive beetles up there. Definitely down south. If you do have small hive beetle issues, you want to make sure that those pollen patties, if the bees are not eating them, you remove them, because it will attract small hive beetles and you can just end up causing a lot more problems with them than supporting the bees, right? So if they're not taking it in, they're not feeding off of it, remove the pollen patty. Okay. This is the question that I get, and I know that most of you will probably be sitting here and thinking to yourself, okay, well, now what, Elina? Thanks for all of this. What do we do now? Which one do I feed? There have not been too many studies where you have comparisons of all of the supplemental feeds on the market, right, at the same time in different regions, and can vary. because bees need different things at different times of the year, so they really can impact the results of the studies like this as well. And then nobody really wants to pay to do that, compared to supplements that are already present, right? I think there's some, I feel like somebody has mentioned that maybe there is somebody who's been doing this. Jamie Ellis has been doing some of this work before. I think Gloria, definitely, the Grandi Kaufman and the Arizona USDA Bee Lab has been dealing with nutrition for quite some time. But Randy Oliver also has done comparison of these different supplemental protein patties, right, or supplemental protein options. And I'm using him here because, again, we're in California and he's in California. So I think that's also really important. I cannot remember. I think he tracked this over time. I think he went out actually later than 88 days, but I cannot recall how long he tracked them. And if you look at it, so this is, he essentially measured the colony strength in terms of frames of adult worker bees present in the colonies, right? Again, over time. This one is specifically at day 88, and he didn't really find any significant differences in terms of colony strength, mathematically, right, statistically. However, there are clearly differences in the average number of frames of bees in differently fed bees. Specifically, if you do not supplement your bees when there's no pollen around and they don't get pollen, they can't bring in pollen, right? They will not do well. So this is no supplement control, right? So no food, no supplement. This, if there's no pollen around, right? There's no supplement here. And then natural pollen control in this case here, right, actually did pretty comparable to, what is it, Ultra B and this bulk protein, right? So I would say, looking at this, there's really, I guess the Ultra B looks pretty good, but again, I would say that it would probably need to be repeated with a little bit more. I know he has really high amounts and numbers of colonies that he does this with, but it does fairly well in comparison to the natural pollen, right? And then some of the other ones also do fairly well, I would say. I'm sure there's some colony variation. You can see there's a bit of a variation there in colonies, right? So this is what, 4.5 frames of bees versus 6 frames of bees. And that's pretty, when you're looking at it biologically, that's significant. But again, there is nothing that I would say, oh my God, let's run and buy just this and feed just this, right? Because again, bees do need different types of feed at different times of the year. So I think the message here, you'll see I have on the next slide, will be very clear. So this is the work that was done by Jamie Ellis and Jamie Ellis's lab. And what they found when they compared these different supplements, and again, these were some of the other supplements, right? So there's Ultra B and Mega B were the same for both studies, right? And then they had Mega B as well. Jamie had Brood Builder and then the Wildflower. When they added this, when they provided this pollen based off of Wildflower, there was slightly more of it consumed by the bees, right? But again, there was really not significant difference, other than looks like the Brood Builder didn't do quite as well as some of the others, right? So these 4, they did fairly similar. Brood Builder, I actually have not heard of it before. So they ate at least pretty much the same amount of these different feeds. And then when they later on looked at the strength of these colonies over 12 weeks, there was no significant difference, right? There is lowest colony reduction, right? So the wildflower fed bees or wildflower fed colonies had the lowest drop in strength of the hive, right? But there was, again, no significant difference. However, again, pollen seems to be doing pretty well, right? And they looked at the nosema counts as well, and there really wasn't, from what I remember, there was not significant difference when they did the statistical analysis, right? So there's the wildflower right there, and the wildflower actually had kind of a high-ish nosema spore counts, and as compared to the other three feeds, right? This is a lot. Don't get scared. I wanted to put it all in one slide because I didn't want to go back and forth. It's from the same paper. Again, this is work that was done by Gloria de Grande Hoffman in Arizona. And when you're, bored at home later on, you can go through this, take a look at it and dwell on it. But what I wanted to point out here is that what they found, they were specifically looking at what happens if you feed supplemental feed to the bees versus those that don't receive supplemental feed, right? They wanted to see if it impacts the varroa mite numbers, varroa infestation, as well as the number of viruses that were present. And they didn't actually find anything striking that said, oh my God, the fed bees do so much better in terms of infection or infestation with varroa mites or presence of viruses that were detected in those colonies throughout the year, right? So there's no significant differences here. It might be significantly higher number of mites on adult bees in fed colonies, right? Which is actually surprising and interesting. But despite the fact that they weren't finding differences in the infection or infestation, or the infestation levels were going in the direction opposite of what you were hoping for, right? What they found was that the fed colonies, again, were stronger, right, in terms of brood, in terms of bees, right, especially later going into the winter. And then also those colonies that were fed survived better. So this was in March, right? The next March, more colonies survived if they were fed. So again, all this to say, feed the colonies, right? Doesn't matter what necessarily you feed them, but they do need that protein supplement. And there are a number of options for you to choose from, a number of different recipes, but make sure your colonies are not starving. And I think one of the nice guides that you can take a look at, it's free, available to the public, from Honeybee Health Coalition, which has also come out with the varroa management guidelines, or guide, not guidelines, but guide, right? They just came out with the Honeybee Nutrition, a review and guide to supplemental feeding. And they have a nice table in there of all of the supplements that are available on the market. And they have, I think, listed the amount of pollen that's in them, some of the ingredients that are in those supplements, so you can take a look and sort of decide what works best for you, of course, keeping in mind the price as well. They're not going to tell you what to feed either, right? If you're expecting to hear, oh, this supplement, you should definitely feed that one, it's not going to tell you that, but it will give you options. And again, feeding is important regardless of what you feed. And if you have access to nutrition, that's the best. Right? We talked over and over again about how nutrition, natural nutrition, and a variety of food sources, when the bees have access to it, it helps with immune and detoxification responses, helps them deal with some of those other stressors that are present in the colonies. What I'm going to do is I'm going to upload all of the slides that are in this presentation to the Google Drive, because I wanted you to have that information as well. I'm not going to go over it, right? I'm not going to go over it into detail, but I invite you to access that yourselves and read over it. And it is sort of an update of the research, some of the research that we've been doing in the lab over this past several years, specifically focusing on nutrition, whether that is exploring what different types of flower mixes are available and should be planted around time when there is nothing else out there for the bees. So almond bloom, for example. We've looked at how those mixes impact colony health. And again, there's definitely data, our data shows that if you have mustard, so this is mustard specifically, right? Mustard plantings in the vicinity of colonies that are even in almond pollination, you actually have better bee population, right? So you have higher bee population during the almond bloom, which is beneficial to your bees and also to the grower if you're going into pollination. We also didn't see any differences in mites, and we didn't see any differences in viral loads either. However, what we did see is the difference in survivorship. So we did find that the colonies that had additional mustard supplements did better than the matching control. Another study that was done is more geared towards urban gardens and urban gardeners. This is work that was done by Dr. Christine Casey and in cooperation with the Rutgers University. And it essentially explores the attractiveness of different pollinator supportive plants and how those plants can be utilized in gardens in California to promote, again, pollinator health, specifically ornamental plants that are commonly sold at Home Depot and Lowe's that are tagged as pollinator friendly, but we haven't actually explored that in the past. So that was kind of the goal of this study, which took 5 years to see which of these plants are really attractive to pollinators, and specifically which specific plants attract specific pollinators. So again, you can look through this on your own time in terms of the methodology and what was counted. These are the plants that were taken into consideration when this was being done. And then there's some data here as well. This is just the first year of data, so you can glance at it. I believe Christine Casey will have some more data on the garden website or Beehaven, UC Davis Beehaven website. So again, I invite you to explore that resource. One interesting thing that she found was that honeybees, which I guess is probably not that surprising, preferred tubular flowers, or more tubular flowers were found on, or more honeybees were found on tubular flowers versus the flat open petal flowers. And the reason probably being is that the honeybees actually have quite a long proboscis, right? So they can actually go get in those flowers and get the nectar out. And if you have an opportunity to come to UC Davis and visit the garden, I highly recommend it. It has been surveyed by the Dr. Robin Thorpe. He has since passed away, unfortunately, but he has been doing a survey of the garden since 2008, so since essentially the establishment of the garden, which is just celebrated the 15th year anniversary, and has been able to identify 85 different species of bees. In addition to natural forage, we have also done some work on impact of different phytochemicals, and I briefly mentioned them. They can be found in nectar and pollen of the plant, so it's naturally occurring. My colleague, Dr. Arati Seshadri, has started this work in the past while she was in Colorado. Then she came to UC Davis to join us, and we've collaborated on some of the work specifically on these phytochemicals. They seem to increase the survivorship of the bees in cages, also impacts the nosema load, so it reduces the nosema loads in bees in cages if they're fed some of these phytochemicals. And we wanted to see if there's any impact on the ability of the bees to produce brood food if they're fed these phytochemicals, right? We did find that if they are fed p-coumaric acid, it seems to increase their ability to produce brood food. At least it increases their hypopharyngeal gland size, which is where they produce part of the brood food. Big topic for beekeepers is probiotics and the use of probiotics. And I think I could still comfortably say that there's still not a lot of understanding of how impactful the probiotics that are currently on the market are to colony health, right, and promoting colony health. In fact, there were a couple of papers that came out, and I know that there were some studies showing that there might not be benefit to feeding. It's not harmful, but it might not be beneficial to feeding colonies these probiotics. However, I think there's a lot more to be explored, and what we've done, we actually have done some work with probiotics different than what is commercially available. What we found was that when we do apply probiotics, it can reduce certain pathogens in colonies. And we started doing this research with our colleagues from Canada because they found some beneficial effect on American fowl brood. It seems that if you feed specific probiotics to the bees, it can reduce the infectiveness, or I can't remember the word. It reduces the American fowl brood potency of the bacteria. So this is just a nice reminder of what a American fowl brood rope out test looks like, right? So if you suspect there is anything going on in your colony and you do that test, the rope or that larva, the melted larva, if you pull it out, it's not going to break. So it's about a couple of inches and it doesn't break. It kind of looks like snot. So again, some of the work was already done at that time in the lab, but we wanted to take it out into the colony. And I think I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. We fed these probiotics to the colonies here in California. And what we found was that when we fed the colonies the probiotic in a pollen patty, right, so pollen patty carrier, there was actually a higher amount of brood that was produced by these bees over time, right? Again, this is published and it's available online freely, so you can access to read more if you're interested. And we also found that the probiotic fed in protein supplement can actually reduce nosema spore loads over time, and more so than in comparison to just the pollen patty, or when that probiotic was applied in a sugar water spray. However, when we applied the sugar water spray with the probiotic, what we did find that there seems to be a decrease or some sort of an inhibitory effect on the causal agent of European fowl brood. We did not detect any Panabacillus larvae, which is the bacteria that causes the American fowl brood. And it also seems to suppress the growth of shock brood causative agent or fungus, right? So all this to say, it's complicated, right? It's complex, it's complicated. It's not a straightforward thing, but one thing for sure is that you need to have your colonies fed. And I know this is a horrible slide, but I really was so excited to see this, and I wanted to snap a photo of it because it is from a beekeeper, right, a commercial beekeeper actually, who does run a lot of colonies. I don't actually know the exact number, but if you look at it, the point isn't to read all the fuzzy writing. The point is that from January until December, bees are fed something, right? And oftentimes it's kind of necessary. So the only time they don't feed is in December. And again, this is going to vary depending on whatever the access you have to nutrition, but make sure that your bees are fed. And in any way, if we can help improve the access to natural forage, that's a plus. Okay, I'm going to, of course, acknowledge the donors and funding supporters. And I'm just going to say thank you here. I love to use my children to make everybody smile. Hopefully I think this is Sebastian. Hopefully Sebastian made you smile too.